Reb Leib this week shares what may be one of the greatest chidushim novelties that I have read from him. And I've read some amazing ones. Thank God we learned some before Passover. During Passover, I shared some of the, monumental milestone chidushim that Reb Leib has taught us. Thank God we're able to share Reb Leib's Torah around the world. But tonight, he really tells us something which hits home, and it's a very, very strong, impactful, real-life application, and also a point that's maybe very, very hard for us to hear and to listen to at the same time. So we're in for an eventful one. He starts off by saying, this week, the Torah dedicates no less than 115 verses between both of this week's parshas, Tazria and Metzora, to the different type of leprosies or reasons why a person gets a leprosy and how a person purifies himself from leprosy. Now, it's obvious that the lengthy details in the Torah about leprosy are intended to impress upon us how important and severe this topic is. However, it is still a lot, and we know that every word, every letter, every speck of ink in the Torah is accounted for. But even with all those 115 verses all dedicated towards this topic, Reb Leib says that the Torah in this week's Torah portion does not give any reason why leprosy would befall a person, or as we'll learn, a person's house, or appear on their clothes, or appear on their skin. No reason. It isn't until the book of Deuteronomy where the Torah gives us the reason for why one would receive leprosy. And I want to turn you, pay attention to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 8 and 9. Listen to what it says. Be cautious regarding the lesion of tzarat, that's leprosy, to observe meticulously. And you shall do according to all that the Levite priests instruct you, as I have commanded them, so shall you observe to do. So the first verse is very simple. It's telling you, be careful not to, to contract this lesion, this tzarat, this leprosy. And if you do, make sure to follow exactly what the Kohanim tell you to do on how to purify yourself from it. The next verse says, Zachor tasher asa Hashem Elokecha leMiriam. Remember what your Lord, your God, did to Miriam, baderech, on the way, b'tzetechem Mitzrayim, when you went out of Egypt. What is that referring to? What happened to Miriam on their way out? Well, the Torah tells us that in Parashat Beha'alotcha, which is in the book of Numbers, tells us that Miriam spoke to Aaron about their brother Moshe. And when she was speaking about Moshe to Aaron, she contracted leprosy, and it is only later on in the verses in Deuteronomy that the Torah tells us, be careful and remember what Miriam got. And it was no fluke. It was actually a punishment for speaking Lashon Hara. So Reb Leib says we have to analyze these two verses in the book of Deuteronomy. The first one's coming to teach us that it's a prohibition, it's a negative prohibition to speak Lashon Hara, which is one of the 613 prohibitions, that you're not allowed to remove or to cut off leprosy from your body. That's what the first, let me just repeat that. The first verse is coming and teaching you, Reb Leib saying that you're not allowed to remove, cut off, rip off leprosy from your body. Rather, you have to go through the purification process, the spiritual healing process that the Kohen tells you to do. The second verse, however, the one of Miriam, to remember what happened to Miriam, has three different approaches to what's it coming to teach. Rashi says, I'm going to go through all three of them. Rashi says, it isn't directly connected to the first verse. Rather, it's coming to stress the importance of not speaking lashon hara, slander, as if you do, it would cause you to be afflicted with leprosy. How would you do that? By remembering what happened to Miriam. That should help us choose not to speak lashon hara. That's Rashi, not connected, but it should inspire us to not speak lashon hara. The Rashbam, another commentary on the Torah, says the two psukim are actually directly connected. And the second verse is coming to stress that no matter who you are, even if you're like a prophetess like Miriam, highest level, it is still, you would still contract the leprosy as a punishment for speaking lashon hara. Nachmanides, the Ramban, says that the two psukim, this is the third way to understand it, follow a pattern. They do follow the same pattern. The first one is the prohibition. You're not allowed to rip off any leprosy, cut off any leprosy. The second is a positive commandment that we need to remind ourselves what happened to Miriam. And since we are commanded to remember that, that will help us and save us from speaking lashon hara. He proves it. He says zachor, to remember, is like other times in the Torah. The Torah tells us zachor to Shabbat. Remember the day of Shabbat. Zachor tashar salach Amalek. Remember what Amalek did to you. Those are positive commandments to either keep the Shabbat or to remember what Amalek did to us. Here too, the same terminology the Ramban says is coming to teach us that it's a Torah obligation to remember what happened to Miriam, and that will help us not to not speak lashon hara. Now, he says, well, how could you equate lashon hara with murder if the Torah would not command us to be cautious about it? So the difference between Rashi and the Ramban is Rashi is just saying the Torah is making a suggestion. It's not counted as one of the 613 Torah obligations. The Ramban says, no, it is one of the 613 Torah mitzvot to remember what happened to Miriam. Reb Leib now says, the Ramban does count remembering what happened to Miriam as one of the 613. Why doesn't Rashi and the Ramban and many others, why don't they? So he says the answer based on the Gemara. You see, just to put things into perspective, if there are 613 mitzvot, Torah mitzvot, and 365 of them are negative commandments or prohibitions, and 248 of them are positive Torah commandments, then if you don't count one, that means you have to substitute it by another one. Or if you count one, you are now substituting that for another Torah obligation. So there are multiple great rabbis who wrote books on counting what the mitzvot are. There's the Bahag, there's the Sefer HaMitzvot, the Ramban wrote, the Rambam wrote. There are those who wrote lists of what are considered the 613 or not. If they're not, then they're rabbinical laws, which need to be observed, but it's a different level than Torah law. So if the Ramban is counting this mitzvah of remembering not what happened to Miriam on her way out of Egypt, that she contracted lashon hara, leprosy for speaking lashon hara, then why do the other rabbis don't count it? Because they don't. Reb Leib answers and says, there is a debate in the Talmud as what brings atonement for speaking lashon hara. One side says it's the leprosy. That's part of the teshuvah and atonement process. And another opinion says, no, it's actually the priestly garments, the Kohen Gadol's, the high priest garments that he would don, that would provide atonement for the Jewish people speaking lashon hara. So then the Gemara asks, well then, if a person, if already the Kohen Gadol is going to be wearing his garments and that will atone, so why does a person need to get leprosy? Or if he got leprosy, why would the Kohen Gadol's clothes, wearing them, atone for speaking lashon hara? So the Gemara says that leprosy only happens only is contracted by a person when there's benefit to the slander that was spoken. For example, it caused a dispute, caused a fight, it caused hatred between the two people. But if there was no benefit, there's no damage caused, then the person obviously did a prohibition, it was wrong, but leprosy would not be contracted for that. Rather, the priestly garments that were worn would provide atonement for that sin. Based on this, Reb Leib says that not all who speak Lashon Hara get leprosy. And Rashi and the Rashbam didn't want to say that everyone who remembers Miriam would be reminded not to speak Lashon Hara, because not everyone gets leprosy. Miriam got leprosy, but not everyone gets leprosy. So the Torah is not counting it as a mitzvah, rather just suggesting, remember what happened to Miriam, but it's not one of the 613. If leprosy would be contracted by every single person who spoke Lashon Hara, then they would have counted it as part of the 613. Now, just to back up 1 second, we're obviously talking the time of the temple, Beis HaMikdash, where these miraculous signs would show up. Today, people speak Lashon Hara, unfortunately, all the time, and we don't get leprosy for it. That's because we don't have the Beis HaMikdash, we don't have the Kohen Gadol, we don't have the Kohanim anymore. I just wanted to put that out there. We've spoken about this in the past. So now Reb Leib asks, why didn't the Torah clearly state the prohibition of Lashon Hara? Why is it disguised? Why is it speak about leprosy in this week's portions, and then we have in in Numbers the story of Miriam, and only in Deuteronomy does it all get tied together? That Miriam contracted leprosy for speaking Lashon Hara. And by the way, the laws of leprosy are back in the book of Leviticus, in this week's Torah portion. Why is it all some type of a mishkababel? Why couldn't the Torah be very clear with a prohibition of not speaking Lashon Hara? So Reb Leib gives 3 answers. 2 of them are pretty simple, but the third one is dynamite. Dynamite. And the beauty is we've learned over the years, I've shared this concept with you at least once, let's call it, for sure. So the reason why the Torah was not very clear with the prohibition of Lashon Hara in the Torah is, first answer is, the Torah is not clear with every single prohibition. There are other examples in the Torah that are not clear-cut, black on white, and that are still considered Torah prohibitions. That's one answer, simple answer. He gives a couple of examples. We're not going to get into them now, but that's one answer. It's not really a good answer, but anyway. Second answer, Reb Leib says, the Satan can only prosecute, Satan, the Yetzer Hara, can only prosecute the Jewish people if there is a clear prohibition in the Torah. So since Lashon Hara is such a hard mitzvah to keep perfectly, as the Talmud says, everyone, even the greatest Torah scholars, have even dust of Lashon Hara. The Torah had mercy on us, Reb Leib said, and didn't write the prohibition of Lashon Hara clearly, because if so, we couldn't bear the repercussions and the punishment of speaking Lashon Hara. So of course it is a prohibition. Of course it's a Torah prohibition and it's severe. But Reb Leib writes, and he says that the Torah did not say it clearly, write it black on white, because if it would have, then we would be held accountable way more, and the Yetzer Hara and the Satan would be able to prosecute us at a much worse level, one that we couldn't bear. So before we continue, so fine. That was Reb Leib's first question. Now he gives a question, and this is where he has 3 different answers. So those are just 2 answers. Just keeping it all in my head. Now Reb Leib asks another question. He says, the Talmud tells us, or the Talmud's literally splitting hairs between speaking Lashon Hara with benefit, without benefit, that there's only leprosy when there's benefit, or fighting or hatred that results from the leprosy from the Lashon Hara. But if that's true, then why did Miriam receive leprosy for speaking Lashon Hara? Did she cause any hatred or fighting? Was there any benefit to her Lashon Hara? I don't think so. So here Reb Leib gives three different answers. First answer is, he says, you're right, there was no benefit, but since Miriam was on such a high level and God treats and judges the righteous men and women at a higher level, she nevertheless was punished and received leprosy. Okay, that's his first answer. So there was no benefit, but higher level. Second answer is there really was benefit and damage. What was it? It's that when she told this report of Moshe Rabbeinu splitting up from his wife, Aaron, this story, Aaron accepted the Lashon Hara. Reb Leib says the proof is the Torah says V'tedaber Miriam ve'Aharon b'Moshe, that Miriam and Aaron spoke about Moshe. Aaron didn't speak about Moshe, it was just Miriam. Because since he accepted what she said, it's as if he spoke even though he didn't really speak. But that accepting of the Lashon Hara that Aaron had was unfortunately a tangible damage for her speaking. Now Reb Leib gives a different type of answer, a very deep answer. And he says, indeed, yes, there was damage caused by Miriam's Lashon Hara, and it caused a much more severe sin with more drastic results than we could have ever imagined. Listen to this. The Talmud asks, why is it that the portion in the Torah that speaks about the spies entering the land of Israel, why is that story right after the story of Miriam speaking Lashon Hara about Moshe Rabbeinu? The end of Parashat Behalotcha in the book of Numbers is where the story of Miriam takes place. And the beginning of the next portion, Shlach, is where the messengers, the spies, are sent into Israel. Why are they juxtaposed? Answers the Talmud, so that the spies should see how severe Lashon Hara is and learn from Miriam and be careful not to speak negatively about Eretz Yisrael. Rashi writes that these wicked spies didn't learn from Miriam. They should have taken to heart what they saw about Miriam. Meaning they could have learned, but they didn't. And like everything in life, Reb Leib says, everything that we do, everything that we experience can either lift us up or bring us down. There was a great moment of learning that they could have had, that could have been done, but since they missed it, it caused destruction. So when the spies saw, Reb Leib says, what happened to Miriam and they didn't learn, even though she had good intentions, she was speaking about her younger brother who she loved, she risked her life for, she spoke in private, there was no real harm or damage done, but still they decided to speak negatively about the land of Israel, the spies. How could they have done that? Answers Reb Leib, because the red line was tested and crossed. The line of nobody could do that, no one would ever do that, was crossed by Miriam. Since Miriam spoke Lashon Hara, they thought, so could we. This was the damage Miriam caused. She gave an opening for the spies to speak Lashon Hara because they were now no longer the first ones to speak Lashon Hara. It's like, imagine you grow up in a community where everyone eats kosher all the time. The first person who eats non-kosher and someone else either sees about it or hears about it, to them it's going to be much easier for them to eat non-kosher because someone else did it already. Same things with everything in life. So she opened the door, Reb Leib says, to Lashon Hara. Now here's the hard part. Reb Leib says Based on this, Miriam was the one who caused the spies to speak Lashon Hara against the land of Israel. And that damage is why she got leprosy. Crazy, no? Now, there's two more caveats over here. Number one is, if this is true, that Miriam was the cause for the spies to speak Lashon Hara in the land of Israel, now we can answer a great question. Question of, why didn't Miriam ever enter the land of Israel? We could understand Moshe and Aaron because they were involved with the Jewish people and hitting the rock. Right? They were both there. Or in the golden calf in some way. But Miriam? Miriam had no involvement in the spies, no involvement in the golden calf, no involvement with complaining for the water or hitting the rock. No woman partook in any of that. Answers Reb Leib, it was because her Lashon Hara led to the spies speaking against the land of Israel. So, and that is what sealed the fate for that generation to never enter the land, to perish in the desert. Miriam was judged measure for measure. Since she was involved in that, she was now not granted access to the land of Israel, which is powerful. It's very scary. So now, Reb Leib ends off with one last thing, and this is in Miriam's defense. Because it's a little harsh on Miriam, right? In Miriam's defense, look how genius this is. This is like so beautiful. In Miriam's defense, how could she have brought herself to speak Lashon Hara about Moshe Rabbeinu? Look what he says. He says, 80 years prior, a familiar event took place. Her father, Amram, separated from her mother, Yocheved. And Miriam mustered up the courage to tell her father off, respectfully, but tell her father off. To tell him that your decree is worse than Paro's decree. Paro's only decreed on the boys, you're decreed on all of the nation. And Amram, the leader of the Jewish people at that time, listened to her daughter. And just as when he separated from his wife, everyone separated. When he got back together with Yocheved, and then Moshe was born, everyone else got back together with their wives. Today, 80 years later, she looks at Moshe Rabbeinu and tells herself that he's here partly due to me, partly because of me, because of the courage that I had to stand up to my father, the leader. Bnei Israel were saved because of my courage, partly. But now, 80 years later, she sees the same thing happening again. She sees the leader, this time it's her brother, not her father, separating from his wife. So she felt like she had to say something. She had to speak up. I have chills when I'm saying this. This is so powerful. She's reliving what she went through 80 years prior with her father, now today, though, with her brother. So she had to discuss this feeling she had with her brother Aaron, to consult with him before she would go and tell Moshe off. Before she would muster up the courage to tell Moshe, I don't think that's the right thing to do. 80 years ago, Abba did that, and we see that was not the right answer. So when she came to speak to Aaron, she wasn't speaking in a negative way, obviously, but her speaking came from, I've seen this story before, something's wrong over here. Now, again, at her level, she was wrong. She shouldn't have said anything, and she was punished with leprosy for it. But just in Miriam's defense, we see where she came from. I think this was a powerful, powerful Dvar Torah. I think the main chidush is that we see that a person's good intention of speaking Lashon Hara spiraled uncontrollably to the most drastic event of the Jewish nation, of their fate being sealed to perish in the desert, which was with the spies seeing that Miriam was able to speak Lashon Hara, and then they went and spoke Lashon Hara themselves. I guess a couple lessons. Number one is, even though we think we will not be causing damage by speaking negatively or slander, very often it does cause damage. Directly or indirectly, we never know. Secondly, this idea of hoping to never be the one who crosses that red line to allow others to do wrong or to follow suit is a very severe thing. And on the flip side, we have to make sure that we surround ourselves with people who don't cross that line. Because if they're constantly testing and crossing that line, it's going to be so easy for us to go ahead and break it. If you're always with people who aren't eating kosher, if you're always with people who don't make blessings before and after they eat, if you are somewhere where no one ever prays, if you live in a community that no one's Shomer Shabbos, you know how hard it's going to be for you to make the right decision? Everyone else is already crossing the red line. They're not only crossing, they're on the other side of the red line. So for you to test that line is going to be so easy because you see everyone else doing it. So on one hand, we can't be the cause for others to sin because if we would sin. And on the other hand, we have to make sure to surround ourselves with people who have a high standard. So this way we can hold ourselves up to that level, opposed to saying, well, everyone else is doing it, I might as well do it as well. Or if everyone else is doing it, I could allow myself to do it also. Which is a very, very powerful, powerful lesson. So may the holy words of Rabbi Leib Heyman be a tremendous blessing to us and a reminder to us of how important our speech is, how it could spiral out of control, and how important all of our deeds are, because we, believe it or not, are always setting an example for those around us.